Welcome to the Eastern Fellowship Podcast. Joining me for today's conversation is Allison Scott. Allison Scott is a gifted community leader and communicator whose career spans multiple industries, including education, healthcare, and housing. Allison has devoted much of her life to serving marginalized communities, and she brings a wealth of experiential knowledge to today's topic. So we hope you enjoy this conversation on disability and the church. It's always fun when I'm in a conversation with someone who I've known for a long time, because I've known you now. Gosh, so we must have met probably in 2006. So that means we've known each other for like 20 years.
Yeah.
That's kind of nuts.
That is nuts.
But pretty fun. So cool. It's cool to like interact in this capacity and to hear more about your experience. And something I often like to do when I'm in a conversation like this with people is to not just start with a big topic, but to actually talk about their story and their journey. And something in particular I've been thinking about is just wondering, what were conversations in your home like around kind of the experience of navigating the world as someone with a physical limitation, or like what were conversations like in your house growing up? I'm just curious about kind of your early formation around self-identity, but also just trying to figure out how to navigate the world.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I'll start by sharing a little bit more context of how I came to be part of the disability community to begin with. So there's kind of like a big before and after that happened in our family, because I wasn't diagnosed with anything until I was almost 8 years old, which is unusual for someone with my condition. Usually people are diagnosed much younger, but my parents had some concerns about my physical development, which were initially dismissed by doctors, and then as I got older, those concerns became more pronounced, and there was a process to figure out what was going on. And so there was my parents received a phone call like a month before my 8th birthday, with the doctor informing them what my diagnosis was, which had taken some time to figure out because it's a very rare condition. So I have a rare form of skeletal dysplasia that, just for folks listening who might find this helpful to understand, it's an enzyme deficiency that affects metabolism, like sort of your body's natural process for breaking things down and creating normal growth. And so my condition is a form of dwarfism. It causes a lot of different skeletal dysplasia symptoms. It can be very painful, and it's affected my growth and organ function, all those kinds of things. And not long after I was diagnosed, my parents put 2 and 2 together and realized that my younger brother has the same condition. So it's a recessive genetic condition, which in our family, there's no family history on either side with this condition. It was a total surprise. We have an older brother who's not affected. And so, it was a huge shift in our family that happened, from that phone call on. And one of the things that has been striking, I think, about my parents' like very first response to that diagnosis was they hung up the phone. They're kind of reeling from this, like, what does this mean for our daughter or for our family? And they went to the piano and they sang "It Is Well With My Soul" together. So there was like this grounding in our family, I think, from the very beginning of like, this is going to be a journey of difficulty that we can't even comprehend right now. But it started with this, like, just a faith and trust in God to help our family navigate it. So that's been, I think, part of like a consistent theme in the way that our family has navigated in terms of the kinds of conversations we had in the home. Like, I think originally, John and I, my younger brother's name is John, were so young and so kind of naive or unaware of what, like, that we didn't take it really hard at first, because it was like, oh, okay, like, we're going to get a lot of special attention and treatment, and like didn't really understand what the implications would be for life, navigating that. And I think as we got older and things got more complicated and the impacts felt more personal to us, the conversation shifted and we became like more the people who were grappling with those questions. I think like in the early days, it was more like my parents who were grappling with those questions and like going through the grieving process. And that happened later for me and John.
Wow. So something I'm thinking about is how, you kind of mentioned how your parents found out and like they didn't have I guess the advantage of having another point of reference within their family to even know how to process that, right? And obviously you and your brother are both young, and so it's all very fresh, obviously, for you too. And so you're kind of navigating that as a family, but I'm also thinking about how you're navigating that within the context of the world, right? And in particular, I'm thinking about the church. Like, I've met your parents, so I'm assuming they've been people of faith for a long time, especially with the example you gave of them singing and playing it as well. But I'm curious, like, what was it like engaging with the church? Like, did the churches you all are part of, um, yeah, how did they kind of navigate or support you, or how did they walk alongside you, or how did they learn from you, or like, yeah, what was that like?
Yeah, this is a great question.
And I say that because I'm imagining for a lot of them, it could also be new for them, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think the church that I grew up in was a huge part of the support system for our family. I know that it was a space that my parents like navigated grief and like processing what this would mean again for people who like didn't necessarily know what it was like directly, from their own experience, but were like willing to come alongside and um, support. John and I both had very serious orthopedic surgeries as elementary school students and then later in middle and high school. Um, and yeah, I remember one of my dearest friends, I call her my best friend 2 generations removed. She was like, you know, 45 years older than me. And she would, when I was like in a body cast for months on end after a major surgery, she came and read the Chronicles of Narnia to me. And that's kind of where we first became like good friends, was through that experience. So yeah, there was a lot of like that wraparound support for our family and care. Even when people might have been fumbling or unsure what to do, like they showed up and leaned in.
Yeah. So you've talked a little bit about the kind of community, the support you had around you, and I'm curious, like how personal faith has played a role in your own self identity with some of this, right? Like how have you kind of understood your own self identity in light of both you physically, but also you spiritually, right? How those
Mm,
two things interact with one another.
yeah. Yeah. I think for me, um, the really hard questions started to hit around like later middle school, when I was like really wrestling with, why does God allow things like this? This kind of suffering and pain, and just kind of all the layers of that as like a young person. Um and I remember too, like there were people, there have been people in um faith communities. Like I have mixed feelings around like um the theology around healing, because while I believe that God does sometimes allow healing, um, I think for me as a young person grappling with like those texts in scripture, but also with people who like kind of came from this background of like, if you really believe it, if like it felt like, oh, if you prayed in the right way or believed the right things or did the right things, that you could like will yourself into healing, or that like God would somehow perform in like a, you know on demand sort of way. And so yeah, grappling with the reality that like that isn't part of my story, um was 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 a big thing for me. And I think like I still probably have some trauma around like the way that Christian communities sometimes engage with healing because of some of those experiences. But I would say like probably the most deeply resonant thing for me in that time of my life and still of grappling with faith questions around disability and suffering was recognizing God's and through Christ, like his deep identification with suffering and with suffering people. I like there's an analogy of like the way that soldiers bond in the trenches with each other, and when there's this like shared suffering, this like there's a way that you experience community deeply with people when you have suffered together, that's unlike any other kind of human connection that you can have with somebody who like has that deep identification with suffering, and recognizing that I have that kind of communion with God himself, who chose to enter into suffering and experience like physical brokenness. And I would say like that part of my story is also really inextricable from my relationship with my younger brother, because like I know that on a deep gut level, and this is an experience that not many people with disabilities have, of having like a sibling who is going through essentially the same experience, but because John and I shared this genetic trait from the beginning, we like just had a bond and understanding of like I don't actually feel like no one else understands me because I had a brother who did, and still do. And so, recognizing like that was intuitive for me to be like, oh, that's how Christ identifies with me too.
Wow. That is fascinating. Like, because the one of the kind of categories that comes to mind for me is kind of this category of solidarity, right? Like either solidarity with Christ, who is with all of us, even in our, you know, limitations or weakness or whatever, but also the solidarity you have with your brother because you're going through a kind of analogous type of situation. And as you're talking, it made me think a lot about Bonhoeffer, right? One of my faves, one of your faves, for two reasons, right? One thing he says or talks about in his lectures on Genesis 1 through 3, creation and fall, he talks about the role of human limitation and how to be limited is part of what it means to be a creature, right? It's part of what it means to actually be made in the image of God. And part of the problem of Adam and Eve is that they are trying to move beyond their limit, right? To like be able to get the one thing that God says they can't have. But the other thing that strikes me about what Bonhoeffer says, I think it's in a sermon. He talks about how weakness is holy, and he connects that with the idea of how God's strength is made perfect in our weakness, and Christ became weak in all these things. So as you're talking about this idea of Christ kind of being in solidarity with us and vice versa, it's like, oh, weakness becomes this place of, in some ways, identity affirmation, right? And to me, there's something really beautiful about that. That like any type of limitation or even weakness is not necessarily something negative or a detriment to us, but actually positions us to experience God in a unique type of way. And I think I kind of wonder, what would it look like for the church to kind of recognize that? Because I think that like culturally speaking, or in our society, there's a lot of things pushing us to view limitation, weakness, or even just difference as a net negative, as opposed to asking the question, what is the unique way that this person can actually reflect the image of God? What do you think it takes to help us as the church to actually think differently? Like, how do we actually name and affirm and even embody this idea that weakness is actually not a detriment or a deficit, but it's a unique way of actually living our identities as the people made in God's image? Like, how do you think how can we be countercultural in how we approach that topic?
I mean, half of it is just acknowledging the truth of what you just said. Like I think that is a big part of it, and it is so counter, particularly for American Christians, because like Americans are very married to our concept of limitless potential and this idea of like you can do anything if you set your mind to it. And actually, like, I think that people with disabilities are often put in that box and like held up as almost more of a device for other people's inspiration. Like, like, oh, look at this person with a disability and what they've overcome and what they've accomplished in life. This just goes to show you that like anybody can achieve anything. And this just, for one thing, it's not true. But and it can also be very objectifying for people with disabilities, or like making disability, just a tool or an instrument for other people's inspiration. Like, oh, if this person can do it, what excuse do you have? Like, there's that kind of way that we, like, as Americans, and certainly within American Christianity, that's like a big problem in the way that we think and encounter things. And I think that at our at our worst, people, Christians, the church, can be quick to offer answers or trite sayings, like, everything happens for a reason, or, God's always got something good. He's going to work out of it, or like these, especially when people are suffering, when we're dealing with pain and loss. And I think at our best is when we just are present with people, when we offer love and support and sometimes silence, just to be with people and to sit with them and to accept in humility that we don't always understand the reason or don't need to offer an explanation or an answer for things, that sometimes we just sit in the mystery and the pain of it, and offer presence in the same way that God offers his presence to us in our pain.
Wow, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Um, you allude to how a lot of times in the church there could be kind of these trite responses to things, and or even you allude to even the instrumentalization of people who are part of disabled communities. And what it makes you wonder or think about is this question of like, what are other blind spots that you feel like either individual Christians or even churches structurally might have that create barriers or sustain barriers to people being included or being affirmed in who they are, or us being able to actually treat one another as people made equally in the image of God. Like, what do you feel like are some of the, because there are people watch this who are like, are there things that we're doing that we don't even know yet? Like, are there any that you kind of that stand out to you?
Yeah. Well, I think the biggest one, I mean, all of these need some kind of qualification. And I should start by saying that, like, I am speaking about disability, people with disabilities as a community in general, but I am only one person speaking from my particular experience and my particular preferences in some of these things. And so, there are people across the spectrum who may appreciate engagement differently than I do. But I would say a first blind spot is just fear or othering, that people hold back, or they're afraid of engaging with somebody who might be different, might look different, might speak differently, might, relate to the world differently than them. And so there's like avoiding, because they're afraid of someone who's different, or they're afraid of doing something wrong or saying the wrong thing. And so they may like hold back. Now, some caution and thoughtfulness is appreciated. So I'm not saying just charge in and do whatever comes to mind. Like, be thoughtful and careful. But I think a first blind spot is just like, I'm not going to go near that with a 10-foot pole. And then I think, secondary to that, the blind spots being, again, that objectification, or using, putting a like silver lining around it, or wrapping it up in a bow to make themselves feel better about the situation. Like, well, you know, at least this is the case, or like, I can see, I know why God did this, because this is allowing you to do it's okay. Like, let's have some humility and not feel the need to put a bow on it or provide an answer. Um, yeah, those are some of the things that come to mind first for me.
That's helpful. That's helpful. I mean, as you're talking, I'm thinking about like how unequipped people can feel. Like you mentioned the fear piece, and like unequipped people can feel to even know how to say the right, how to say the right thing, or how to avoid landmines or whatever it is, right? And as you're talking, it made me think about a situation I had where I got invited to guest preach at a church, and I planned to preach on Jesus healing the man who'd been crippled for 38 years. And then I entered the church, and then I realized like probably at least 20% of these people have physical limitations or impairments, right, or disabilities. And so in the moment, I'm like, oh, okay. I'm like thinking through everything I'm planning on saying in
Yeah,
terms of like,
yeah.
am I saying this right way? Am I not? But in that moment, by that point, you got to preach. You can't.
Sermon was prepared.
It was hard to
Yeah,
prepare.
yeah.
And so, but what I had to do in that moment was to say, oh, I actually have no choice but to choose to be courageous and to trust that if I say something wrong, like I need to be okay with being corrected and be humble in that moment, right? And yeah, but I felt that tension of, or that inner angst of, oh, I want to do the right thing and say the right
Yep.
thing, but I'm like second guessing, because intention and perception are two different things, right? And so, and to your point, every person, like, it's not like the disabled community is some monolith, right? So I think I felt that fear, and I think things went fine. But I understand like why people would experience that, right? And so to me, I mean, kind of like what you said, it reminds me of like, oh, that's actually an opportunity for both humility, but also openness to learning and being willing to make mistakes, but also choosing to be really thoughtful to the best of your ability. Um, yeah, that's yeah. So I'm curious, like, what do you think are other steps churches can take to be more? Let's backtrack. Another theme that came out of what you said was this actually a theme that has come up in a number of our conversations on this podcast, and that is a theme of like um visibility. And by that I mean situations where like different minoritized communities feel like they're not seen by other people. And I guess my question is, what do you think it means for the church to see people who are part of the disability community, and to do that in a healthy and helpful way?
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I think particularly in I mean, this is true in the disability community in general. I think it's especially true in like, or it's true in a particular way in the like dwarfism slash little people community that I'm a part of this idea of visibility and invisibility, because it's like true in a very dualistic way. Like in one sense, little people are highly visible, and like, it's something that we're very aware of, like, especially if I'm with my brother and the two of us together, and I use an electric scooter most of the time when I'm in public places for mobility. And you know like I was recently in the grocery store with another little person, and the kids in that grocery store were all having like a whole heyday. I mean, they just like their eyes were like this the whole time. They were so like, confused. Why is this person who is my height but doesn't look like a kid? How are they even real? Like, just, so there's a fascination that comes with difference, and like the stares, the attention, sometimes the like unsolicited comments from strangers, the like, I think since I was a kid, I've had a hyper awareness of how visible I am, in the sense that like if I leave the house, people are like paying attention to how I dress, like what I look like, how I conduct myself, and making judgments about that. So there, on one hand, there's this hyper visible sense of existing in a body that's different. And there are times that I just wish that I could, you know, not draw that kind of attention, or just show up in an anonymous way, or like allow people to get to know me before, literally sizing me up and making, assumptions about who I am. And then there's this other side of the coin of like hyper visible, but also feeling invisible, not seen, or just sort of, sidelined, or again, that assumptions thing. I think this is a kind of a universal experience for minority communities, that you like feel people paying attention to you, but you also have this feeling of like your individuality is lost, of, oh, people are gonna just, oh, that's like a person who's part of this group that I'm not a part of. Like, I'm not gonna, to go near that. So I think for church communities, and really any social group, it takes conscious effort to like get past the very human and natural thing that we do of making observations about people based on how they look, how they conduct themselves, and to say like, I'm gonna take the time and be intentional about noticing you as a person, getting to know you, asking questions, and at times it's disability. Like, sometimes it's helpful when people ask questions about, what could I do that would be helpful? What do you need in this space? Offering help in that way. It's a delicate line to cross. And again, people with disabilities have very different feelings about this. Some people would prefer to not have people offer help, and they would like, I'll speak up if I need it. Other times I have really appreciated a lot of the time when people have been proactive to say like, hey, I've got stairs in my house. Is this going to work for you? Or is there a way that we can make this space more comfortable for you? Like, it's kind of a balance for me. It can also be suffocating when people are like overly preoccupied with it. So it's, that's a little bit of a delicate dance. But I would say it is better to try and fumble than to like, again, be fearful or avoidant and not say anything.
Yeah, that's helpful. I wonder if a lot of times when um, certain communities are like become marginalized, I wonder if that often goes hand in hand with like majority communities not recognizing how much they actually need
Hmm.
people who are different than them. I'm
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
what do you think that the church can learn from people who experience disability in these types of ways? Like what? Because I do feel like a lot of times, yeah, I think a lot of times the church can like not see people and marginalize them, not realizing that they are also experiencing a deficiency as a result of not
Yeah.
engaging. Um, so how can the church actually be more enriched if we actually even just think more about these types of intersections more
Yeah.
consistently?
Um, I've been thinking a lot about finitude recently. You kind of mentioned this earlier in something you were saying, just like what it means to be human and how that is inherently limited. And I think that that is more intuitive for people with disabilities than it is for people who don't have disabilities, or I maybe should say don't yet have disabilities, because a lot of people will experience disability at some point in their life. As we get older, as bodies change and age and those kinds of things. So um, I think there's a way that people with disabilities are like equipped and prepared. And like, I have been in the school of finitude since I was 8. I like, it is very intuitive, and I have daily and hourly reminders in my body of my own finitude. And I think, yeah, that has produced in me some humility around like, I'm not tempted to feel this sense of like limitless potential, like I can do anything I set my mind to. Like I feel that deeply in my body. And I think that perspective is one that all people need to reckon with. And I think that there's a way that people with disabilities or who are dealing with illness maybe further along the continuum of like grasping that reality and helping other people to navigate their own finitude, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
You earlier you talked about how like the ways that your church community, especially when you're younger, kind of helped to support you and your family. I'm curious, like as you think about the span of your life and your connection and involvement with churches, how much have you felt like churches have actively and intentionally or explicitly talked about disability? And that could be in context of a sermon, or it could be beyond sermons.
Yeah,
But
very rarely,
yeah,
very rarely. Um, I mean, I think that churches talk about suffering and people. I mean, churches often will like address a variety of things that people may be going through in life, um, in sermons and small group discussions and things like that. But yeah, my experience has been extraordinarily a minority experience. I have a really rare condition. It's 1 in 300,000 people. So there hasn't been like a rich community for me in churches and school and college, like growing up, aside from having my brother, and then as an adult finding really rich community of friends who live all over the country and world who like have similar experiences that we've connected long distance through various community groups and things like that. But yeah, the church has been, I would say, like a safe place for me to navigate some of those things, but often not, you know, with people who are willing to listen and learn, but not necessarily like, oh, I, have experienced this myself or can relate
hmm,
directly.
yeah, that makes sense. Are there any other questions you feel like churches should be asking themselves as they think about how to be faithful in these types of situations? And I can use some context for my question
Yeah.
because I'm thinking about like I think about church structures, I think about church culture, I think about logistics, right? I think about language. I feel like there's just so many different both potential landmines, but also potential opportunities to like use these different avenues to love people well. And like I went to seminary, so I'm like, oh, in seminary, how much did we actually like how to what extent did we become equipped to like think about this well? And then that's an open question for me of like, what were some of the missed opportunities? But then also like, okay, what did I glean that I still carry with me? And then how can those gleanings like manifest tangibly in a community that I'm helping to steward as a pastor, right? Like, yeah. So that's kind of what where my question comes from around like, you know, what we can do.
Yeah, I think taking time to listen, to learn, to educate yourself. I mean, obviously, like so many things, there's a wealth of resources for understanding this. I think, it's also important to be grounded in the community that you are in and in the congregation that you're a part of. So, again, like the disability community is extremely diverse, and the types of needs, and like it's pretty impossible for, I think, any one church to be universally accessible. But I think that like having an openness to being inclusive and finding creative ways of creating access for the people who are part of the real community that you're in um, is important. And so, like the church I grew up in, John and I were the only kids in the youth group who had disabilities, like visible physical disabilities that were impacting mobility, at least that I can remember. And the church installed an elevator when we got to be like old enough to start going to youth group because the youth room was upstairs. I don't think that was the only reason they did it, but I think it was part of it. And I think like it sort of pushed them to say like, hey, this is the time to do this. It's probably good for the building overall, but like there's a particular need. So I think being in tune with the needs in your particular congregation, and yeah, asking the questions, asking people what's helpful. It's kind of a basic thing to say, but just paying attention, like
Yeah.
where might people be struggling to connect or access something, But I also think it's important as part of any community to say, like, not every space is going to be or needs to be like inclusivity at the forefront. Like, am I glad that churches have basketball leagues as a point of connection for people? Even though that's not a space that I can connect in, yes, I'm absolutely glad. Like, there are going to be times and spaces where this is part of my experience as a person with a disability that I won't participate in. But I appreciate it when there's thoughtfulness and when, like, in the general course of things, there's effort made as much as possible to be welcoming and accessible for people.
I appreciate that. I thought part of what you kind of connected this to is like how we can be responsive to the people, like ask people questions of what would be most helpful without being presumptive about it. And so it's like instead of saying, "Oh, we want to be inclusive church or accessible church," let's just think of 10 things we can do. Like actually talk to people and get to know them. I think that makes a lot of sense. Something else you had mentioned earlier, you alluded to was you talked about aging, right? And like in general, and how you made the comment that like all of us are going to become limited in some form. And I wonder if like that awareness can help us to normalize, right? So like, because in my head, I'm thinking about scholars who've talked about disability and talked about in terms of a spectrum, as opposed to like, oh, this person's disabled and this person's not, and there's this huge bifurcation. And I kind of wonder like how or what can help us as Christians to actually understand that span, right? In a way that helps us to normalize, in a way that helps us to and not ostracize, right? Like because you recognize, oh, it literally affects all of us in some form or fashion, or it will. um, yeah, how can we get to that point, right? Because I mean, to your point, like you said, culturally in America, we think we can just do whatever we want to do. We can pull ourselves up and accomplish all the things. And a lot of times we also push aging people away from us in different ways. And so we kind of live in this delusion of, oh, I can always just do all the things. And then we're surprised once we get older and realize our body starts talking to us a bit more. Right. And so how do we, like, is the key to that? Is that about like um, uh, more interaction across some of these lines, whether it be generationally or whether it be, in terms of differently able communities, or like all the other practices we can engage in that can help us to kind of live out the reality that we're all kind of in this, even though there's uniqueness to our experiences. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think at the root of it, some of it is just good old pride. Like, people, we want to, and, American pride in particular, this idea of like, I'm invincible. And again, like anything I put my mind to, I can accomplish and achieve. Um, and some of it is just, holding yourself in humility and recognizing that, like, first of all, we have far less control than we like to think we do. And yeah, and it's part of embracing being human, being limited. And I think a lot of people grow into that maturity in time as they age, and um, if you don't, you'll become delusional or deranged just because, life is frustrating, and like your body changing and as you age is frustrating. And so I think, I would agree with you, like being in intergenerational communities is also a big part of that too.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Before you talked about kind of, obviously you're 8 when you're kind of initially starting to process some of these things more explicitly. But like, if you imagine someone who is kind of at a point in life, maybe it's through aging or maybe it's through something else happening in their life where they're kind of coming to grips for the first time with, oh, things are different and I can't do certain things that I would like to be able to do or be a part of some things I want to be a part of. What advice would you give that person if they are watching this or listening to this?
Oof.
No pressure.
Advice. Advice. Yeah. I think there have been times in my life where I've been like, oh, you sweet person in your 60s who's like, I'm feeling what you're feeling too. I'm like, well, first of all. It's different. I think again, that whole idea of being like, I've been in the school of finitude since I was really young. It's just a different kind of experience. But I think that it is any time we're encountering suffering or loss, and these types of things are certainly a part of that. It's an invitation for us to embrace the mystery of like not having the answers to why things happen. I think it's also important to and okay to recognize and grieve the loss of those things. And I think, yeah, it's a chance to learn and grow, to, deepen a contemplative relationship with God, and one that's a little bit less like triumphant and maybe a little more, like you said, like weak and humble and unsure.
Yeah, yeah. I love that. And I also wonder, like, what does it look like for us to begin to ask those questions and do that probing before we're at a point where there's some like catalytic event or, because to me that's really about just Christian discipleship, right? It's about like how do we have a helpful and actually sustainable conception of who we are and our self identity and what it means to embrace the limitation of being human and all of its different manifestations, right? And I think that's yeah. If we could do that, I think you're right. It's like that triumphalism is one term that's often used sometimes used in Christian theological circles is like Christian triumphalism, right? But like I feel like that means something different in that context. But I feel like, yeah, we are kind of often wed theologically to this notion of, obviously victory and overcoming and being able to, yeah, overcome all the things, right? And so, but then you run into a situation physically where it's like, oh, you don't overcome in that way, right? And and even then, I think a lot about like, so I was taking a class in seminary on theological anthropology, actually with Dr. Willie Jennings, and we started talking about the question of like resurrection, and it raises question about like the connection between our identity and different physical limitations. And I don't want to misquote him, but I remember him asking the question like, what people were saying, oh, the afterlife, everything will be fine, everything's good. He's like, well, what if I like my glasses, right? Because he's experiencing limited sight today, and so someone else is saying, oh, in the resurrection, you won't have to deal with that. But I think the question he was raising was like, so what's the relationship between our identity and limitation, especially when you take the moral, kind of the moral denigration off of the limitation itself, right? And so I guess just we talk about theology offline a lot, but I'm curious, like, how do you think this relates to your earlier point around like the relationship between disability and theologies of healing in the Bible? Um, but I'm curious, like, how do you think about the resurrection in light of like current limitations? Because I asked not because I have an answer, I don't, but
Yeah.
I think it's very interesting to think about that.
Yeah. It is interesting to think about it. Ooh, I don't know. I remember, I have to ask John if he still thinks this way, but I remember him at one point saying when we were probably teenagers or like in our early 20s that he always pictured himself like being small, even in heaven. And yeah, I don't really know what I think about that. And in terms of like what it will look like again on the like maintaining mystery and unsure, what will redeemed bodies look like? How will we be embodied as people? What will human limitation look like? I don't know. Um, I think I'm open to being surprised about that question. But I think, regardless, like the idea of um, inhabiting a space where there is no more pain and suffering is deeply comforting to me. But what that looks like in practical reality, like who knows? I mean, really, who knows?
Yeah. I mean, the only evidence we have is Jesus, right? Like he's
Yeah.
first fruits of the resurrection,
Yeah.
and he clearly has scars, but
Yeah.
he can also pass through walls when he's. So it's
Yeah.
like
Yep. Yeah.
somehow, um, yeah, it's not like there's this complete escapism from our current reality, but it's the redemption of that reality in some way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything I didn't ask you about that you love to share?
Hmm. Um. Well, you mentioned this at the beginning. We have been friends for 20 years now. We met, like second year of college. How has being my friend shaped your view of disability, would you say? And like, um, how did you maybe like relate to that, you know, early in our friendship? And again, being in a space where like, well, we were both minorities in very different ways, but there weren't like, college, UVA was not a place that was like really rich and lots of people with disabilities. Like there were very few of us. And so like, yeah, I'd be curious to know what your perceptions were and like how that, you know, shaped you. I told you I was going to turn the question back on you. So
This is
this
great.
is my
That's great. That's
chance.
great. That's a great question. Because I'm thinking about like 20 years ago, how would I answer that question? Wow. Probably a few different ways. I think that uh so I'm thinking both about like hmm. Sorry, I'm in my head, I'm gonna sound like a nerd. So Immanuel Kant has a distinction between intuitions and concepts. So like you can touch a hot stove, you feel it, but then you actually conceptualize and make sense of that feeling.
Yeah.
And so I'm imagining like, oh, I think my feeling, which is also a thought, my feeling back then, one of them was um I think recognizing how little consistent interaction I'd had with someone with a very visible disability. And so I think I that also fostered feelings of I don't know if ignorance is a feeling, but feeling ignorant in some ways, especially early on, I think. This is the first time I'm thinking about this. Um in this type of way. I think I also uh pretty quickly learned, and maybe it's because of your personality. I'm like, oh, this person's not asking for my pity. Like that's not what this is about. Like, um, so I think I very quickly learned and realized like, regardless of how I interact with you or anybody else who may be in a similar situation, how I interact needs to be dignifying and doesn't and can't presume that I'm in some kind of superior position to help. So like clearly I can help and do things, but like I think
Please
I think
open the door. Yes.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
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 I think I was challenged to discern what it's like to relate to someone as an equal because they actually are, not because I'm just making a choice to assume they are. Like they actually are, and so I need to not make these hierarchical assumptions subconsciously. And so I think I wrestled with that some. I think it opened up my eyes, and maybe this is in some ways a little easier, even though the different experiences, because I'm a racial minority. So um, I don't think it was completely like, oh, this first time I'm wrestling with the idea, like, what is it like to like be different than most people in this way? Like, I've thought about that before as a black person, um, but again, but the experience is obviously still unique, right? And so I think from that vantage point, it also helped me to develop even deeper empathy in different ways of like, oh, like all of us are kind of going through life and are experiencing different um, expressions of marginalization or minoritization, and so I think I thought a lot about that. Um, I think it shaped how I mean, even concrete things around access. Like, so, um, yeah. So if I am helping to convene an event, right, I'm thinking about that. Or like, literally 3 weeks ago when we were doing the men's and women's gathering across the street, I'm with having conversations about like how do we help people if they need to do the stairs or whatever, right? So like, so I think it shapes that for me and has shaped that for years. I think the other thing is that I think it helped to humble me because I realized, oh, well, one, there's a lot of stuff I don't know. And also, I need to be okay with being willing to ask questions, and to not presume the answers to those questions. Um, yeah, wow, great I'm gonna be thinking more about that. Yeah, but I think it's definitely shaped both how I've interacted with you, I think in a really helpful way, but also shaped how I see the world. Um, it also helped that a section of my dissertation also engaged in this topic. So I was like, okay, I'm thinking a lot about this now in like academic way. But I think the other impact for me is kind of the normalization of these types of differences. And I think that I think I've come a decent way, but I think the church writ large can still go a lot further in terms of kind of the normalization and because there's so much othering that happens and most of the time that othering I feel like is not actually intentional or explicit, but it still happens. And to me as a pastor, I'm trying to ask the question like, what are the different ways that manifests, and how can we actually live differently? Like, how do we as a church, like we have the Bible. The Bible has all these different, you know, anecdotes and situations and instruction around inclusion and accessibility, and all those things. So we of all people should be the most equipped in theory to, model something different in our world. And so I want us as believers to be proactive in asking those questions, but also humble in asking those questions, because I think there's a way to assume that because we're Christians, then of course, we're going to get it right. When in reality, we could be just as wrong as other people. And so we need to be humble as we are asking these kind of questions. So that's a long-winded way of answering your question. But I definitely think it shaped me. It's probably shaped me in ways that I'm not even aware of, honestly. So
Same is true for me too. So yeah, have always appreciated your insights, and your friendship has also been profoundly formative for me. So
Aw,
yeah.
thanks.
As you were talking, one more thing that came to mind too that I just want to say, before we close out, and this is maybe more to people who are listening who are themselves dealing with disability or illness, or like impacted with someone that they love who is dealing with disability or illness, or just again like aging, human limitation, or like encountering your own finitude. I think that there are ways that kind of suffering can cause people to like become deeply self-absorbed, or so anchored in their own experience and suffering, or so, like troubled by God's allowing that in their life, and can become like very inwardly turned and bitter and frustrated. And but it can also create pathways for you to develop like an extraordinary empathy, and to become a person who has really like a wellspring to offer other people, and engaging with your own suffering, with reckoning with that with God. And you have choices in that, in those, and how it shapes you. And so I just want to offer that as an encouragement to people who may be like relating to this in a different kind of way, like a very personal way, to allow that type of suffering to break you, to grieve it, but also to allow it to create in you that kind of empathy and humility and love. So yeah,
That's amazing. That's amazing.
yeah.
Well, I appreciate that, and I know that those who watch this will also appreciate those words, and I'm sure it will help us all to live differently. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here.